Okay, good evening, everybody. I think we should start. It's lovely to see you here this evening. Thank you very much for turning out on this cool winter evening. We have a fabulous panel here, introduced by my colleague, Professor Dina Matar. I'm Alison. My name is Alison Scott-Bowman. I'm a Professor of Society and Belief here. And you're here today because we are running a small research project where we introduce ideas into the corridors of power. We're working with Westminster. We've found, I don't know if you were here last week, I'll make this very brief. We've been developing an understanding of democratic processes, and it's very, very useful to know that you can get to an MP, you can get to a minister through an MP. There are ways in which we can get our opinions heard in select committees, for example. So there's a lot to achieve, but we're also running these panels on really important issues. And I won't say any more, just hand over to Nina, who is masterminding this event. Thank you, Nina.
Thank you, Alison, and thank you all for being here at SOAS today. Just a note for our online audience, you can use the hashtag ICOPJourno to submit questions and to also just join the discussion. And for YouTube viewers, you can use the chat feature to submit questions. We'll try to answer them at the end. So this is the third and final event in the Journalism in the Firing Line series. Last week we looked at the case of Julian Assange, and before that we looked at the issue of threats to journalism and threats faced by journalists when they challenge powerful interests. So the title of today's event is Data and Privacy: Who is Allowed to Share Information? We want to explore what data do governments and corporations hold and share on individuals? What happens when journalists whistleblow about data harvesting? And we want to answer the question, is data sharing a one-way street? So Dina Matar is our host today, and she will discuss these issues and more with our panelists. Just to tell you a little bit about Dina, she's the Professor of Political Communication and Arab Media at SOAS. She's the Director of the Centre for Global Media and Communication. Before turning to academia, she had a career as an international journalist and editor covering the Middle East, Europe, Asia and Africa. She's also the author of several books and articles. So Dina, over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, and thank you for asking me to chair this event. I hope that we can have a productive session. I have a very exciting panel here. I will introduce them shortly. But I want to give a general idea of why we are here and how do we link it to journalism and democracy or democratic processes. So I think it's very much around freedom of expression. Because freedom of expression and freedom of information play a vital role in democracies, whether we agree that democracies are the only way for modern societies to exist or not. At SOAS, we try and think of alternatives as well. And we trust in the idea that democratic systems relies on people to ask questions of public officials, public bodies, and people who kind of control our lives in different ways. And they operate on our behalf. And we also ask questions to try and understand and scrutinize the decisions of local and national government. And of course, this goes back to the very normative and ideal functions of journalism, which is to hold government accountable, to mobilize, and to provide information, which we see in our societies today sometimes cannot be practiced in its full sense. So it's an ideal, it's an aspiration to reach to. But with that, we need to think about free press and think about the implications of data and implications of privacy, implications of sharing information and who to share that information with and the consequences of that. We talk about that a lot in our global media classes in the sense of the responsibilities of ordinary people, not only journalists and people in power, the responsibilities of ordinary people to the lives of others, sort of by sharing information, whose lives do you put in danger? And that happens a lot in authoritarian state, populist state, but also in democracies. So Journalists, in the sense, perform an essential function, whether that is by informing the public about what takes place in the halls of power or by holding elected officials accountable. Their work can create social change, bring issues to the forefront of decision makers, and help citizens to participate in the society. But also their work can cause divisions in society. So we're not looking at it as being always a positive thing. But I guess that one of the key issues here is, and kind of responding to the title and our panelists, is the question of what happens to the practice of journalism when we have laws on data and data protection changing, and how do we understand them, and what implications do these have for journalists' safety and well-being and for society's safety. Our panelists tonight will seek to answer these questions, and I hope, and I haven't strayed too much from what we're going to say here, but then hopefully we can have the questions, and then with that we can have questions from the audience as well. I would like to introduce our panelists by going immediately from my left, so I will introduce them all at one go, and then that way I can begin to ask the questions. But if you feel that you are, I'm speaking too fast or whatever, just raise your hand and let me know. So first is Silkie Carlo. She's the director of Big Brother Watch. She previously worked for Liberty as well as Edward Snowden's Official Defense Fund and Whistleblowers at Risk. She's the co-author of Information Security for Journalists and a lifelong campaigner for the protection of civil liberties, particularly in the context of new and emerging technologies. Obviously, the digital world, the datafication of our society has changed practices in a big way. Welcome. Peter Geoghegan, hopefully I have pronounced.
Geoghegan, you're not far off.
I'm not far off, okay. Is editor-in-chief and CEO at openDemocracy. His journalism has appeared in numerous international titles, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Guardian, and the London Review of Books. His most recent book, Democracy for Sale, Dark Money and Dirty Politics, was published in August 2020 by Head of ZEARS. Very interesting read. Mariano Santi is Legal and Policy Officer at Open Rights Group, a digital rights organization that upholds privacy and freedom of speech online. He is an expert in data protection with a background in information rights and media law. We might need you to come and give a session to our students and classes. Megha Rajagopalan is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist for Buzzfeed News based in London. She writes about international affairs, technology, and human rights. So welcome all. Thank you for giving us your time tonight. And I will go straight to a question that any of you can answer, which is what information does the government hold on the public and how do they obtain this? What type of information, how can we assess that? And does the public have access to this information? Is it everything? Does the government hold all information on the public, or does it go only? Does it hold some? So, in a sense, how does it obtain this information of the public? I mean, these are really important questions because they govern our lives in different ways. Yeah.
I'll buy. Well, thanks so much. First of all, it's lovely to be actually in the room with you, and thanks for coming out on a cold evening to talk about this. It's such a broad question, and it's quite mind-blowing, and I wonder how much your perceptions have changed maybe over the last few years, now that we understand just the scale of government data collection that is happening all the time. Of course, the real eye-opening moment was when Edward Snowden blew the whistle from his post in the NSA back in 2013. It certainly blew my mind. That's when I decided this was going to be what I worked on for, almost 10 years. But I wonder how much that's actually sunk in with each of us. Do we really understand that there are government agencies that collect all of our communications all the time? And what does that mean in the context of the technologies that we have? Some people find it reassuring that it's just passive. It just goes in a database, we're kind of blasé about our data. Like Facebook's got it, Google's got it, so what does it matter that the NSA and GCHQ have it? But I hope that we can think about that a bit more critically. I mean, interesting, you had a session on Julian Assange recently. Of course, when there are individuals that become particularly at risk, which can be journalists or publishers or dissidents or anyone else, this kind of data collection is a real issue, but also it's an issue for communities at large, because journalists now have to operate in an environment where they know, in fact, whether it's their own government or a hostile government, their data is being collected and can be accessed, and actually can be subjected to more targeted intrusion, like direct interception or even hacking remotely, and not even be able to detect it, and would never know about it. There's all kinds of intrusive things to think about. And even if an ordinary person who had no intention of ever disagreeing with their government or any government, which I don't think is probably anyone in this room, but even if you were that type of person, you were totally fine with everyone, any government or any corporation having your data. The fact that now the technology is being used to pass that data, that you have algorithms, artificial intelligence, and other kinds of advanced technologies that sift our data all the time, this starts to become a real concern. Taking it maybe out of the abstract just for a moment, away from intelligence agencies and nation states, down to your local council, who in most of our experience are not the most competent lot, and you might not trust them with very sensitive amounts of your data, but worse, to be using algorithmic tools or AI tools with that data that they actually don't understand and don't know how it works. And you can have all kinds of discrimination baked into these tools. So right down to that level, now we are starting to uncover mass data gathering and processing, for example, to detect fraud among welfare recipients, or to predict criminality among young people, typically young black men. And so the possibilities for harm and discrimination and political oppression at an individual but also at the community level are vast. In short, the answer to the question is, what do governments and how much data do governments and corporations have on us? Despite everything you hear about GDPR, despite the data protection laws that we have, pretty much everything at some level. And what we have to work out is how do we make sure that we protect the data that's most important to us and advance data protection in light of these new technologies?
Thank you. Does anyone else want to comment more on this topic, or perhaps give examples? Yeah.
Yes. Well, first of all, hi everyone. I mean, on this I can just add on top of what Silkie said, that it's probably good to consider that today the difference between what government holds and what corporations and the type of data that corporations are holding is thinner and thinner. And generally speaking, they don't live in silos, but they are rather two, let's say, different sectors that are speaking to each other. This works in one way, meaning that, for instance, government can fundamentally have access or collect information from corporations, and this is part of what was revealed by Edward Snowden, and generally speaking on the level of cooperation between law enforcement agencies and private corporations on the one end. But this also works on the other way around. So, for instance, you have a lot of private corporations that, through procurement or via public-private partnerships, get the opportunity to collect a huge amount of data that come from public sources. Yeah, I mean, like the general understanding that it's important to gain nowadays is exactly that these two things are not separated, but they are part of a similar picture.
I mean, we used to have a very simple exercise in one of our classes, which is a digital journey. So even using your travel card, and putting your travel card on the barriers in the underground or on the train, this is data. You're giving data. Someone is getting access to that data. So even using your phone, GPS, location services. So it is very, very pervasive. But perhaps you've answered the question around corporations and governments, but if any one of you would like to give examples of where governments and corporations have obtained about, information about the public without their consent, in a sense, or where this issue was not clear, and how transparent is this process? Silkie, perhaps you are the most, perhaps one of you can talk about that, but maybe someone, would you like to?
Sure, I'd be very happy to. I think like what strikes me listening to this as well is that, you know, and thank you very much for having me as well. It's lovely to be here. You know, there's almost the two sides of this equation as well. You've got data protection and you have access to information. And in some ways, the two things feed each other. People need to figure out to be able to access the information that are held by about them by government and corporations. And actually, that's becoming harder and harder. It's becoming harder for people, individuals or groups to understand or to find out information about themselves. And to give one example of an investigation we did recently at openDemocracy into spying on environmental activists, and we were able to uncover that BP, the oil company, had paid a company called Welland, which is basically a reputation management company set up by ex-MI5 spy, to surveil environmental activists who were involved in protests against the British Museum here. And the reason we were able to find that out, we were able to find that out was working with activists, and they put in a thing called a subject access request, which is under data protection law, means that you can find out what information an organisation has about you. It's quite broad, it's much broader than FOI, and they put in the subject access request to BP, and BP responded and sent them their data, so they were able to find out that BP had been surveilling them. You could see they were like marking down where they'd been, they had pictures of them, they had, you know, details about where they lived. But interestingly, when they sent this same request to Welland, this company that existed, the company ignored them, didn't respond to the request, did nothing about it. So what's interesting about that is actually, you know, in some ways you could take that as a case, you could go all the way to a tribunal, but that's expensive, it costs time, you need lawyers and money. Most people don't have that, you know, the poor have no lawyers. So actually, often what's happening is even the scale of corporate data holding is quite hard for individuals to gauge because they can't get access to the information. So what you're having on the one hand happening is, you know, is a confluence of information being held more and more and shared. Actually, what was interesting as well is our investigation found that BP and this company Welland were obviously sharing data across, you know, so people's private information was being shared across between, you know, a large conglomerate and a private spying firm. But at the same time, the individuals involved access to what information has been held, and then which the flip side is almost certainly the amount of information that individual can know about that's been held is probably much greater than not even they found about. So what strikes me as well is there's almost an unevenness in the way legislation even exists. It's supposed to allow all of us to access our information.
Thank you for that. So in the case of spying on the environmental activists, was that with the intention of stopping them or perhaps knowing what they were going to do next? So could you elaborate a bit more on that?
In some ways it's hard to tell because Welland wouldn't release the information that was held. But what we could tell was that they were, you know, wanting to find out things like where these people were going to be, things like their social media profiles, social media posts, if they were going to be at the AGM, at a company at BP's AGM, you know, because these activists are involved in this campaign called Art Not Oil, which was protesting against BP's sponsorship at the British Museum. It's been very high profile. And what's interesting as well is this kind of, you know, stories like that reveal the two sides, say, of corporate conversation, say, around the green agenda, where in public you have companies saying very, you know, nice green things, but in private doing things like spying on activists, but which is very, very concerning as well. But more widely, you think about, well, what happens then when companies are surveilling people? What's happening to data? What's happening to, you know, and we wouldn't know this. You know, there's large aspects of this we wouldn't know, and would be impossible to know if it wasn't for some of the regulations we have. But those regulations, most people don't know they exist. They don't know that they can find out this information about themselves. So that, you know, it's kind of news to most people. It's only when journalists often engage with members of the public, like campaigners, and say, you can do this, that it's possible to do it. But actually, there's probably a lot more information that's been shared that we just don't know about.
Thank you.
I just, excuse me, wanted to add just another example. I think that touches on some of these same themes. I think when reporting on these issues, I think a lot about consent and what meaningful consent means from consumers. And I think there's another aspect of this which applies to biometric surveillance. That's something we've looked at a lot. We did a piece a couple of years ago that looked at CCTV cameras in like central New York City. Obviously, CCTV cameras that's an old technology. That's not even getting into some of the things we talk about now, like facial recognition and stuff like that. But these cameras are obviously everywhere in every major city around the world. And we wanted to see if we could use footage from these cameras to map somebody's movements. And when I started on this project, I thought this is gonna take us forever to do. And it actually took like less than an hour to map somebody's movements, all across Times Square in New York City. And the way that we did it was we basically just looked at publicly available webcams, which make up a very small component of CCTV cameras that are in cities, right? So why would there even be webcams that anyone could access in Times Square? It turns out that there are actually travel companies that have put up these cameras essentially in an effort to create like kind of accessibility, where someone who maybe can't visit New York for various reasons could just go on the internet and see what's going on in Times Square on any given occasion. And we contacted the company and said, well, this is kind of an issue, like a privacy issue. And they said, well, there's a little sign underneath the camera that says, you're being monitored on CCTV, which I thought was very interesting because it raises this question of like, what is consent, right? They would say, if you read that sign and you continue moving this space, you've given your consent. But I mean, for that to be true in today's world, you would effectively not have to even move in public space. Because now we're talking about not only CCTV in highly trafficked kind of dense urban areas, but we're also talking about people putting Ring cameras on their front doorsteps and all kinds of other, like video-based surveillance. So I think in that sense, it's caused me to think about how we can reevaluate what consent actually means in this context.
Yes, this is a brilliant point about what is consent and who can give it, and whether people actually understand how they are surveyed and so on. But basically, this comes up to the General Data Protection Regulation. There are potential changes to that, and perhaps you could talk about it. How will this affect the way that people's data is being held and their rights to data protection, and who benefits from this ultimately? So perhaps you could continue your Megha, maybe you could continue your talk around rights of people to know whether they are surveilled or not, and right to consent, and perhaps you could talk about the GDPR changes.
I'm definitely not an expert on GDPR. I might leave that to some of my fellow panelists here who know a lot more than me. But I would say that I've noticed in my reporting that like GDPR and other privacy regulations targeted at consumers have made a significant difference, I think, in how tech companies target people. So I'll just give one example. So we did a piece on period tracking apps with research that was published by Privacy International. And basically, period tracking apps, for anyone who doesn't know, are apps that are used by a lot of women basically just to monitor their menstruation cycles. And it's really just for convenience. And it can, in addition to just monitoring that, you can put in things like physical symptoms, like whether you have cramps, whether you have mood changes. So really personal information. Obviously, it gets into all kinds of health issues and issues around pregnancy and stuff like that. And one of the things that Privacy International found that I thought was really interesting is that when they were looking at apps that were primarily catering to the European market, there was a much higher level of privacy protection. And then when they started looking at apps that were catered to, that were targeting mostly like South Asian women in India and Pakistan, for instance, where privacy protections are much less, these apps were collecting a lot more data. And anyone could figure out what data these apps were collecting, but the reality is most users do not examine terms of service that closely, nor should they be expected to, of course. So we found, like when I was talking to users of these apps, they were like quite shocked at how much data was being gathered. And I think to me, it showed why legal frameworks for this are so necessary.
Thank you. Would anyone like to comment on, on GDPR? Perhaps
yes.
link it to impact on journalists as well.
On the GDPR, let's say, well, let's start from the fact that, okay, when we talk about data protection, we talk about something that partially overlaps, but it's not necessarily the same as privacy. where if for privacy we mean, let's say, the right to be left alone, or generally speaking, the right to exclude or to disclose certain information only to the people who we would like to, data protection is instead about the fact that information is power and data are used to take decisions that will affect and will have an impact in your life, and therefore you deserve protection on and accountability on how this data is being used, collected, and eventually informs a decision that will have consequences for you. And let's say, having said that, what's the impact of the GDPR, let's say, on data collection? Well, let's say the GDPR imposes obligations on those who have data, obligations about using information in a legal way, in a transparent way, in a fair way. Most importantly, obligations about accountability. The second aspect which is important to mention is the rights for individuals, meaning that apart from giving an active obligations on organizations to basically do certain things, you also are given powers, so power to have access to your data, power to ask for your data to be rectified or to be deleted. And eventually, which is of course related to both of the points I just made, there are remedies. So of course you have the right to lodge a complaint, you have the right to go to a supervisory authority, or the right to go to court if you believe that your data is being mishandled. And let's say altogether this is meant exactly to create a situation where, let's say, the data that is being collected and used against you is not done in an unresponsible way or in a way that actually has adverse consequences to you, but rather is done in a way that considers, let's say, your point of view, your vulnerabilities, and generally speaking, your interest in the equation. I mean, because I was asked about what's going on in the UK and what are the changes that are going to take place, I mean, there are a lot of changes that are being considered by government, but generally speaking, we can say that both these three levels of the GDPR will be impacted, where on the obligation sides, organizations will have much less obligations in terms of treating your data legally, fairly, transparently, and so forth. Your rights will also be watered down, meaning that they will empower basically organizations to do more things that they would like, and to oppose, let's say, what could be your requests on this fact. And finally, also the access to remedies, and generally speaking, access to, I mean, your right to recourse is watered down. So, I mean, to kind of wrap it up and to try to give a very short explanation of this, we could say that whether data protection was meant to protect you from an adverse use of data, what the UK government is proposing to do is basically to reverse the table and to create a regulation where it is the organization that is using your data, which is being protected by your claim and by your rights to have control, and generally speaking, to have your interests considered. Yes, I will leave it here for the time being.
Thank you for that. So, question about when you visit a website, the default position seems to be that you have opted in for your data to be used. So in a sense, it's an example of the lack of control, or you lose control of your data. And that opted for your data to be used even by a third party. And you're expected to take the initiative to opt out. But what are the potential problems with this? So, for example, maybe one of you can talk about NHS data collected by the NHS. And this has become a particular problem, I think, or will be a particular problem because of COVID-19, sort of all these apps. So would one of you like to talk about this?
Well, so that's not supposed to be the case. And one of the good things about GDPR is that when you go onto a website, or for any data controller, they can't just assume that you want all of your data to be taken by them and sold on to other third parties. So, in fact, if you find yourself, automatically signed up to a newsletter or automatically enrolled in having your data tracked when you're online, then you have a legitimate data protection complaint to make. You may have experienced this with like one of the worst players, I mean, I would say like they're a big deal, they're not, but like Domino's, for instance. Like everyone's been plagued by Domino's texts, creating pizza addiction up and down the country. And they're so relentless, and they have no permission to be endlessly texting you, because unless you've actively opted into that, if you've just had a transaction with them, they don't have the right to be plaguing you with marketing. I think there was another, was it like Nando's or Wagamama? I don't know. I don't want to say a company. There was a company that got in trouble for this, but normally they don't get in trouble at all. But where it comes to government agencies or the NHS, for example, well, here this is a different territory, because it's not about consent, it's about what they deem to be a legitimate purpose. They don't need your consent. In fact, consent is a really high barrier for them to get, because they need to actively evidence that you've said you want them to have X, Y, and Z data about you. So normally they'll rely on saying, we've got a legitimate purpose to have your data. And as has been said, what constitutes a legitimate purpose and what data might fall within that has massively expanded over the past 2 years where coronavirus is concerned. This has led to all sorts of things, like AI scans were being done on chest images in hospitals without consent. I've monitored too many to remember of all the kinds of intrusions on data and privacy over the past few years. There was one where, I forget, it was an astronomical number, I think hundreds of thousands, if not more, of people who had their phones monitored after going to the vaccination centres, because researchers wanted to see how behaviours changed after people being vaccinated. Did we go out more, or did we stay at home, or what happened? That's very intrusive stuff, very private. Talk about sensitive medical data, because they're inferring something about your medical status from that as well. All sorts has happened. But here, so talking of this confluence between private and public data and how obscure it is and how little we know about how our data is being used, there is a massive project within government called the COVID-19 Data Store. And it involves Palantir, who are like the truly bad guys of the data world, terrible track record for doing all sorts of bad things, absolutely love collecting everyone's data and doing awful things with it. And they set up this COVID data store within government that we really genuinely know very, very little about, except that there are masses of data, probably on all of us, and it's being sifted and processed by Palantir and by the government all the time, and we have next to no rights in relation to it. We really don't know what it's being used for or how it's being processed. This is a big problem. As we saw after, what Snowden revealed in 2013 was a hangover of a very rapid response to 9/11, when mass surveillance infrastructure was shipped into government agencies. Rights were deprioritised, and you had the Patriot Act, you had all sorts of things happen very, very quickly. All the norms shifted. Well, I can guarantee the same has happened in the past 2 years in post-coronavirus. And the question is, what is it, and how long is it going to be before the truth really comes out about how much has changed? But the COVID-19 data store is absolutely something that needs to be investigated. I think we found from the contracts, which were incredibly hard. I think you guys worked on getting the contracts out.
Yeah, we actually ended up having to try and sue the government to get the contracts.
Yeah.
Because they were refusing to publish the contracts under which the data was held.
And some of the data categories in there covered political opinions, all kinds of things. You think, hang on, that's not to do with coronavirus. So you have to be vigilant about this stuff, don't you?
Well, thank you for that. That is very interesting. And sometimes, as you were talking, I keep remembering the ONS figures that come out every week. So presumably that is collected through Office of National Statistics figures. So that is, again, collected to try and give us a sense of how many cases of COVID are there. But obviously, it's not only the numbers, there must be something else. But let us move on and think about a question which is related to when people visit a news website, for example, to read or watch the news. Is it only that media outlet which is profiling the user? So maybe, Mariano, you can talk to us about advertising on news website and how data is collected, because that is so annoying when it happens, you know, sort of you all of a sudden getting adverts popping up.
Well, the short answer to the question is no, it's not on. I mean, actually, the website that you're visiting is playing a very little role in profiling, but it probably worth just taking a step back and seeing how this system works. There are two main elements. The first one is the profiling aspect. So let's say every time you visit websites, you have trackers or sensors that are basically recording the fact that you access this website and you interacted with certain contents. These interactions are linked to you by a unique identifier, which are called cookies. Or, I mean, there are other technologies that allow you to achieve this, but it's mostly cookies today. And generally speaking, the fact that over time, different organizations managed to collect huge amount of data about the website you visited, the videos you watched, the article you read, allows them to draw a profile about basically your behavior, and from this takes the name of behavioral advertising. Second important aspect of that is the broadcasting of personal data, because what happens is basically that every time you visit a website, other than recording your activity in there, the fact that you are visiting this website is being sent to a marketplace where advertisers are bidding in real time in order to basically get the right to show you the advertisement that they want to show to you. And let's say this effectively means that, let's say, your profile that we were talking about before, so let's say the total of your activities that they know about you eventually is being shown to thousands, potentially hundreds of thousands of individuals or advertisers that want to bid on this. Yes, of course, here you understand a bit the scale of the problem, because apart from the fact that, because on the one hand you created a system where in order to decide which kind of shoes they should show to you as an advertisement, they are basically tracking each and every step that you do online. And on the other hand, they're not only tracking this, but they also decided to tell it to the public. Like an offline, let's say, metaphor of this would be if you ever enter in a shop, you have a special news in the BBC saying that, you know, you just entered in that shop and this is what you're buying. And if there is some advertiser which is interested in selling you advertisements, this is the right time of doing it. Yes, I don't know if there is anything else that...
Yeah, I think a follow-up question is whether there are any ethical concerns, for example, that companies are collecting, particularly advertisers, are collecting all this information with or without our knowledge. And there, you know, is it, can be linked to maybe psychological profiles to sell us products more effectively. I don't know whether you've heard of this famous psychologists or maybe social psychologists who, Edward Bernays, who began an advertising campaign on television in the United States in the 1950s to try and sell cigarettes. And the way that, you know, he used the videos to correlate between smoking cigarettes and emancipation, particularly for women. So in a sense, you know, there is a field of study around, you know, psychology, persuasion, and advertising to try and understand that. But I want the question about ethical concerns, if any one of you would like to address that.
Well, I can probably start with that. Let's say, so on the one hand, yes, there is this aspect that by creating these profiles, in theory, this allows in theory and to exploit your vulnerabilities, or generally speaking, to basically leverage on what could be your personal characteristics. This is definitely one aspect of the story, although we must also say that This doesn't have the scale that they usually report for the simple fact that these technologies are fundamentally very, very inefficient. For instance, we observed this as Open Rights Group when we started filing subject access requests to political parties in the course of, basically in the aftermath of the Cambridge Analytica investigation. And we realized that the commercial data that political parties had bought from data brokers to decide whether to target you with certain political advertisement or not were mostly wrong, meaning that most of the times you were misrepresented, and therefore, their ability to kind of leverage on this information was questionable. Or another example that comes to my mind is a similar complaint that was filed by Privacy International against some data brokers, and in particular they mention one profile where, let's say, the data broker claims that this person is a man, has a family, and is interested in golf, and actually the person is a woman, doesn't have, she's single, and she's definitely not interested in golf. So, let's say, the ability of these systems to actually do what they claim that they can do is questionable simply for the fact that behavior is not necessarily a proxy of who you are, and generally speaking doesn't capture whether, the fact that, for instance, you're reading an article about a strike or about, I don't know, the Me Too movement doesn't capture the fact whether you are supporting or against, for instance, the argument that is being exposed in there. However, and this is very relevant in the field of journalism and media law in general, what these systems are very good at doing are telling whether you are a Guardian reader or a Telegraph reader. And this in the advertising world is very, very important because what used to be the main stream of revenue for the media sector was exactly the fact that advertisers will come to you because they know that as you are the Guardian or as you are the Telegraph, you have a certain kind of audience that is and advertisers are interested in talking to that audience. Behavioral advertising, however, allows them to target, for instance, a Guardian reader on a different website, which could be the weather forecast website or which could be a misinformation website or whatnot. And of course, this is on the one end, it is enticing for advertisers because it means that they can spend a lot less money for paying let's say, second-class website for showing you the advertisement that they wanted you to show. But it is also incredibly dangerous for the media landscape because it means that basically you're losing, they are losing a source of revenue. And eventually what happens is exactly that when we talk about disinformation and all these kind of clickbaiting websites, this is a business model that was made possible exactly because of this system, because there is a system that allows you to target, or at least gives you the impression to allow you to target someone based on their characteristic, but on websites which are cheap.
Yeah, thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to comment on this? So what impact do these changes have on journalistic practices, as this is kind of a panel related to journalism in crisis? In what other ways are journalists being hindered by rules and regulations about what data they are allowed to share? For example, the proposed changes to the GDPR and also to the UK Official Secrets Acts. How will they, or how are they proposed or seen to be impacting journalists? Perhaps, Peter, you can talk about that.
Yeah, I'm not an expert on the GDPR Act or on the proposed changes to the Official Secrets Act, but one thing I can say is what you're finding more and more is plaintiffs attempting to sue journalists not under defamation but under GDPR. So I've actually just had it today, where someone is saying that rather than trying to sue you for making, for a defamatory statement or an error in something you've published, they're suing you over your use and holding of their data and their information. And that's happening more and more in the courts, actually. You're finding it more and more. There's a very famous case against Global Witness, the campaign group where Benny Steinmetz, an Israeli scion, who was accused of corruption in West Africa, he, rather than suing Global Witness for defamation for the articles that they published about him, which revealed that his knowledge and awareness in corruption in West Africa, they sued him for data protection, for holding his personal information. And this is definitely happening more and more. I see it more and more. You know, as I said, I was dealing with literally just today where someone is trying to tempt you, suggesting they can sue you because you hold their personal data. So there's definitely an issue with that. And also what's happening, and this has happened a few times too, is that people that you might report on sending in subject access requests. This is what actually Benny Simon said. He sent in a subject access request to Global Witness, which they refused. Is sending in subject access requests to journalists to try and get the information that journalists hold about someone, which again is not done in a sense of wanting to find out information. It's done in a sense of intimidation. It's also very expensive for, you know, especially if you're targeting people like Global Witness or openDemocracy, with lawsuits under data protection. So that's certainly something that seems to be happening more and more, at least in my experience.
This is pretty dangerous. But how is it affecting work as a journalist? How does it impact your job as a journalist? And maybe you can tell us about examples where freedom of expression, freedom of information was requested. So perhaps, Peter, again, you could comment on that, and perhaps Megha can come in.
Well, I'd be very brief. It just means if someone's trying to sue you, you've got a lot of time you're spending trying to, it takes a long time to enter legal letters. You have to go through it and go, did I say the right thing? You go back to your lawyer and you go, oh, I hope I didn't forward the conversation I had with the lawyer to the other person. It takes a long time. If you're a small organisation, someone's constantly asking you these legal questions. And even if they're not trying to sue you, even if they're coming at you through a lawyer just in general, it just takes a lot of time and energy that for small organisations you just don't really have.
Megha, please.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think the point about small organizations is a really good one because, I mean, we're already seeing this crisis in local news reporting because of the economic realities of traditional journalism, and this is another cost that newsrooms have to plan for, to assess risk for, even for larger organizations. Like, it definitely affects how reporters and editors think about reporting. If you assess that there will be a greater risk that somebody that you're reporting on is going to sue, that is obviously a disincentive to report on that person, even if there's a case of significant wrongdoing, even if it's airtight, even if it's clear that they've actually done the thing. So I think that the real risk is that this tactic is going to be used, it already is being used, but the real issue is that it's being used strategically to impede reporting, to disincentivize reporting, even in cases where there is a strong public interest in knowing those facts.
Thank you very much for that. So it's really, kind of a difficult situation, because if you're always worried about being sued, and how are you going to do your job as an investigative reporter? But perhaps I have a question to you, Silkie, which is in terms of, we spoke earlier about data used in marketing to sell products, but what about the use of data in profiling people in the context of surveillance and policing? Do you have examples where this has been used? And of course, I kind of welcome anyone else to make the comments, but Silkie, I think you've worked on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Profiling in particular, well, I expect a lot of you have heard of the gangs matrix, which was used by the Metropolitan Police. So this was essentially an intelligence database held by the Metropolitan Police, quite light on actual intelligence, but that's the premise of it, was to collect data relating to gangs and gang activity and violence in London. That actually ended up being a very poorly put together database of primarily young black men, children even, in London. And being on this database was incredibly stigmatizing. And a lot of people had adverse impacts as a result of being on that database, whether it was being targeted by authorities or interventions with their place of education. I've had some shocking stories about some of the outcomes that arose from that. So certainly all kinds of authorities are now in the business of collecting data, which may be on their own terms, or it might be through the aid of private companies. Another police example was there was an AI system that was developed by Durham Police Force called the Harm Assessment Risk Tool. and it aimed to predict an individual's risk of reoffending before they'd actually been convicted of a crime. It already was trying to predict their risk of reoffending. And one of the pieces of data that went into this algorithm is something called Experian Mosaic, and actually a lot of political parties used Mosaic as well. Experian, you're probably familiar with, is a big credit reference agency. And they offer this tool called Mosaic, which basically attributes a stereotype to every one of us. Every adult in the UK has a Mosaic classifier. I think there are about 60 to 70. Different types of profiles, stereotypes that we apparently fall into as a product of our postcode. So it's generated on your postcode. Have a think about what would someone assume about you if all they knew was your postcode. And the types of profiles that Experian came up with were, for example, they had one called disconnected youth. That was a certain type of person. Maybe the postcodes might be around here, I don't know. They had, so they're really offensive stereotypes. One was dependent greys. There was also one that was really unapologetic. It was Asian heritage. And Asian heritage said, for example, it kind of tells a story about who these people are. Asian heritage means that you, and I'm quoting, live in high-density housing, inexpensive Victorian terraces, and that when you do have a job, it tends to be low income, for example, food delivery. This was the granularity of the kinds of things they're assuming on the basis of someone's postcode. So this tool is already pretty intrusive, very crude, terrible in terms of perpetuating all kinds of stereotypes and prejudice against groups. It's bad enough, frankly, it's bad enough that it exists. It's built on 850 million pieces of data, mind, that Experian scavenges about all of us. It's bad enough that this thing exists. It's bad that political parties use it. And by the way, it's all the political parties who were kicking off on broadcast about Cambridge Analytica and all of that stuff. And they were not doing dissimilar things in terms of targeted advertising. It was actually being used in the criminal justice system as well to make life-changing decisions about whether people were going to be prosecuted or not, whether they're deemed at risk of being a reoffender or not. After we published that, Experian changed some of those stereotypes, some of those profiles. So they're just euphemisms now for the same kinds of things that they assume about people. And also Durham has stopped using the heart system as of summer 2020. But they'll come back for sure. I mean, they've been harmed by the bad publicity, but I think they'll go away and try and clean up some of the public perception aspects of it. And this is exactly the kind of thing that we're going to see much more of, which is why groups like ours and journalism exposing this kind of stuff is so important, because there is a real appetite within authorities, particularly police, to be using this kind of technology and getting that kind of data from data brokers.
Thank you so much. Anyone else would like to comment on this point? Or maybe we could move on to a question. Maybe Megha, you can talk about Chinese authorities. You discovered in one of your reporting, they were implementing a policy of high-tech and pervasive surveillance of the Muslim minority population. Can you tell us more about this? What was the response of the Chinese authority to your reporting? Are you banned from China now? Presumably, yes.
So I was based in China, in Beijing, from 2012 to 2018. And I've been reporting on this subject for the last several years. Basically, to summarize the issue, most of you follow the news will know a lot about it already, but in the west of China, there's an ethnic minority populations, mostly Muslim, talking about around 12 million people. They're mostly Uyghur Muslims. And since 2016, the government has taken a number of highly repressive measures against that population that has been termed a genocide by a number of governments, including the US and a few others. And there's an aspect of that is directly tied today, I think, to our conversation about privacy and surveillance, which is the kind of connection between the mass surveillance measures that the government has enacted specifically on that minority population and other things like mass incarceration, detention in like huge concentration camps, and forced labor and sort of forced birth control and things like that. So some of the things that our team has looked at is kind of the connection between the surveillance system and incarceration. And I think as a person that comes from the US and lives in Europe, I think it's been really striking because we see a lot of the same technologies here, but obviously they're used in a very different way. And if you look at what the Chinese government has done using surveillance technology on ethnic minorities, it shows the kind of capacity of these types of technologies to be sort of used against specific groups of people. So like, I mean, to Silkie's point about categorizing people, this is like a really good example of what the government has done. One of the investigations we did, we looked at patents that were filed by companies that make facial recognition products in China and have rolled them out in Xinjiang and places like mosques and, public places. And we found that, the patent filings boast about their capability to distinguish people based on race. And they specifically mention Uyghurs, as well as other ethnic minority groups. And on the ground, you can see how this works in practice. Like I've visited checkpoints, like roadside checkpoints outside of train stations and stuff like that. And in at least a couple of them, basically what happens as soon as you walk in, it's like airport style security, and there's two separate lines. One is for Han Chinese people, who are the majority ethnic group in China, and the other is for ethnic minorities like Uyghurs and other Muslims. And if you're in the second group, you get shuffled off to have your phone checked, manually opened and scrolled through, and and basically put through a kind of like an elevated security protocol. And some of the things they're looking for are banned apps, things like Facebook or WhatsApp, which are banned in Xinjiang. They're looking for evidence of religious belief, like Arab songs, pop songs, photos of mosques and things like that. And then all of these things can become criteria for you to be detained. And the last thing I'll say about that is that Human Rights Watch has actually published some really amazing work on this. And one of the things they uncovered is that there is actually a digital system that is known as the IJOP, the Integrated Joint Operations Platform, which is essentially a system that was developed by private companies and is being used by law enforcement in Xinjiang essentially to collect and parse and put together information that builds profiles of individuals. And the amount of information in this system is unreal. The way Human Rights Watch did this research is that they literally downloaded the app on like the Android App Store, and they reverse engineered it, which was like quite ingenious. And I've personally met people that, like Uyghur ex-prisoners who had engagement with this app, who were told this is the reason that you were detained. And it's a very like strange experience because the things that the app collects are like things like your travel patterns, your electricity usage, what kind of job you had, how many checkpoints, meaning like how often you left your little town, whether anyone in your family is pregnant. So in other words, the kind of most ordinary prosaic details of everyday life. And using these details, the system and the authorities who manage it aim to build profiles of people and essentially assess their risk to the society. And if you look at the government's public statements about these camps and why they exist and about the prison system in general, they always talk about it in terms of risk. And I think that's really fascinating because the way that certain groups of people are categorized as high risk or low risk to social stability is something that we see mirrored in discourse, like even here in places all over the world. And I think it really shows what can happen to privacy rights when you have a government with the means to acquire really high-end surveillance technology that may or may not be good in terms of accuracy, and kind of universal will to implement it without any kind of legal barrier to do that.
Thank you. That's a really good example. And I guess you've answered the question about the role of social media companies or kind of in perhaps providing the spaces and the platforms for governments to use. And of course, for me, as you were talking about the Chinese case, I was, of course, thinking of the Israel-Palestine case. I'm Palestinian, and I'm always subjected to what for me is almost like, something that practices that are very much about my private rights, what I feel are my private rights. But I wanted to ask you, before we move on to questions, because I would like to invite questions if you don't mind, is the right to privacy. Can someone comment on that? Is this kind of a recognized right in international law? Or is it like we talk about, for example, freedom of expression? It is right to freedom of expression, but it hasn't really been recognized as internationally as a law, But I don't know whether the right to privacy is understood that way or not. Perhaps one of you could talk about that.
Sure. Well, I mean, it's. I guess the situation of the right to privacy is similar to the situation of freedom of expression, meaning that on the one hand, it is internationally recognized. It is in the Charter of the United Nations, and it is in many international instruments. The two most relevant ones are, let's say, I mean, although it's not necessarily correct to talk about privacy and data protection in the same manner, but we have on the Council of Europe and in general on the European Charter of Human Rights, the Article 8, which is the right to private life. This is a right to privacy, but eventually it was interpreted extensively also to encompass a dimension of information self-determination, a right to information self-determination, so a right to basically data protection. And then you have in the European Union the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, where this distinction is, I mean, like basically this evolution comes to an end, because you have Article 7, which is exactly the right to privacy, and you have Article 8, which is the right to data protection. And generally speaking, both in terms of, I mean, while privacy is a right that has been enshrined in legal instruments for a very long time now, when it comes to data protection, you can see that there are a lot of initiatives, a lot of legislations that are going on in Brazil, in the United States, even in China or in India. Although, yes, of course, I mean, the problem about that is that, as with freedom of expression, then this interacts with how states are organized and whether the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary exists or not. And this, of course, has very practical and substantial implications in terms of whether you actually have this right only on paper or in practice.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, of course, privacy is a protected right, and that was the European Convention on Human Rights was born after the Second World War, and so all of those rights are born from the greatest turmoil that Europe experienced, and there's a reason that privacy is in there, because it's so important. It's so important for everyone's protection, freedom and well-being. You can only develop as an individual if you have a private sphere. It's what balances your rights against potential of intrusion of the state. What we're up against now, I think, in and the European, the right to privacy is incorporated into the UK Human Rights Act as well, of course. So it's protected in domestic law. What we are grappling with now in the context of rapidly changing technology is the potential for a reimagining of what privacy means. And that's one of the reasons that some of the test cases that we run are important, because we're learning how courts view it. So post-Snowden, Big Brother Watch and Open Rights Group, and lots of other groups, about 16 of us in the end, I can't remember how many, lots of non-profit groups came together to challenge the British government over mass interception. How can it be that we have the protected right to privacy, and yet everything we do on the internet can be surveilled by our own government, or even, mass phone calls, text messages, can be surveilled by our own government. How does that marry up with the idea of privacy? And I'm afraid to say we did essentially win our case, but it certainly wasn't, I'm going to be honest with you, it wasn't an in-principle win. In that courts aren't saying that you can't do mass surveillance, you can't do mass interception with these, in light of these rights. And that's something we have to continue to press against and assert what it is that privacy actually means to us, because I am getting now really concerned that, if you think about the scenario that Megha set out that's happening in China, atrocious level of surveillance, but it's prescient because people feel it in their everyday lives, because the way that data is being collected is then being used to abuse people. But actually, the data collection that she described is totally feasible for our own government to do against our own population. The Investigatory Powers Act that was passed in 2016 under Theresa May's government gives the government enormous scope to collect all those fields of information about all of us and keep it in massive data sets. From the government's point of view, there is no privacy intrusion until a human analyst picks up your file and reads it. But until that point, all of the data can be collected and processed and stored. Like, why not? It's no intrusion. Oh, it can be sifted through by computers and artificial intelligence software and all the rest of it. Well, that's a recipe for disaster, because there will come a time, it's a matter of time, and obviously there were massive worries about this when Trump came into office, because he started talking about deliberately targeting certain types of protesters and all sorts, and sounds like the agencies probably put their own kind of defences up against some of the things that he might have liked to do. But this is such a risk, and it's what Snowden said, all you need is a change of administration or someone determined to use that data in a different way, and suddenly things could get very nasty indeed. So we mustn't be complacent about the extent of surveillance that we have in our own country, and how much the right to privacy is being reinterpreted in light of data collection capabilities and new technologies.
Oh, thank you very much. Maybe we should invite questions now. I mean, there are so many questions I have and follow-ups, but thank you to the panel for your insightful comments so far. And
maybe if I give you a couple of the online questions, and then we can open it up to our audience here. There's going to be 2 mics going around the room, so if you just raise your hand if you have a question as well. But from Rahma, can you say something about authoritarian states using software to spy on the activities of journalists and opposition party members? And I'll give you one more, if that's okay. Was the Cambridge Analytica scandal a one-off case, or are there other companies which collaborate with Facebook to carry out targeted political ad campaigns?
Peter, do you want to answer the first one, or?
I guess I wouldn't claim to be an expert in it, but we have seen the Pegasus revelations from last year. Like, we have seen the extent to which both authoritarian and what we mightn't call authoritarian governments are using or capable of using things like interception devices, encrypted messages. We saw with Jamal Khashoggi and the Mohammed, who's the murdered journalist, murdered by the Saudi regime. Again, there seems to be elements of that happening there. Like, it does seem as if it's becoming increasingly sophisticated. Just having someone's mobile phone number alone will allow you don't even have to click on links anymore. So it is becoming increasingly sophisticated and increasingly easy for those who possess this sort of software. And also what's happening as well is companies are making a lot of money from it. Companies are selling this software, and almost a nod to the second question is we don't, like, sometimes the software, whether it works or not, is almost up for grabs too. So people are making lots of money out of it. Producing software that sometimes probably works a lot, maybe doesn't always work, but they're also making money out of it.
Thank you. And the Cambridge Analytica question, is it a one-off, or are there many Cambridge Analyticas around there? Or do you see, I mean, that was the question. Would anyone like to answer that?
Can I come back on the first question just quickly first? Just for good measure, I have to mention some limited transparency data that we have about how the police access, this is very different to Pegasus and obviously some of the horrible things that have happened as a result of that kind of exploitation. But sometimes you can get data about how many requests police have made in Britain for journalists' communications data in order to identify them or their sources, or it's normally their sources. And there are hundreds. So I think the last one I can distinctly remember is like a maybe 2.5 year period, and there were over 200 requests. So it does happen even here. As to Cambridge Analytica, I don't think it was a one-off at all. In fact, I think a lot of us who work on privacy day in, day out were thinking, a scandal, or it was the business model that we've been criticising for a very long time. And as I said, they certainly they were not alone in using those kinds of methodologies. So but it's so important that it caught public attention. It absolutely deserves to. And I hope that we see future exposés of in relation to all those kinds of data broker practices.
Yes, Megha.
I'll just add to that by making what is possibly a fairly obvious point, but I actually think it's, the question was about journalists in authoritarian countries, but I actually think that the point about sources is more important because, when people, like journalists we make up a small group of people, I think, but I think the reason that it's important is that when you have surveillance of journalists, it's usually of communications, and it not only jeopardizes the security of everyone that has talked to this journalist, but everyone that they might talk to. And it creates a chilling effect because sources know that this risk exists, particularly in authoritarian countries. It's very, very obvious. And if they think that they are being watched or listened to, then they will not speak to journalists, and that means the public is deprived of that information. So I think it's really important to think about it in terms of the whole system, and it's not just about journalists, it's about this chain reaction that's created that leads to a society that is less open and less free.
Any other questions? Do you have, Nina, you have any other, yeah, please. Can you, yeah, if you need to get the microphone first.
So this is something I was thinking about throughout the presentation, but I wonder if you all could expand a little bit on how we can determine the difference between a legitimate use of data and an illegitimate use of data, because I think you've talked a lot about what most people would consider illegitimate uses of data, like commercial and policing uses, and yet these are the uses that data often is available to, and yet things like, Megha, I believe that a lot of your work relied on satellite imagery, and I know a lot of Human Rights Watch work, for example, on Myanmar, relied on satellite imagery as well, which some people might consider a privacy violation. So where do we draw the line between public data that might be somewhat intrusive, but is legitimate versus use of public data that is illegitimate? I also was thinking about, so in my undergrad in the US, I was at a university, Temple University, that did a lot of work on local public policy. And what I heard a lot was people would talk about that Facebook could get accurate data on whether public policy interventions worked, but the government couldn't. So even though the security aspects of the government might have access to this data, the public policy arms of the government were not able to access it. So the uses that most people consider beneficial weren't happening for that data, yet the negative ones were. So how do we sort of make sure that the people who we want to have the data can have it, but the people we don't want to have the data don't?
Anyone would like to answer that? Yeah.
I can take the first one. Thanks. That's such a good question about satellite imagery. That's something I've been thinking about a lot more lately. We used satellite imagery to map prisons and internment camps across the Xinjiang region last year, and obviously we used Google Earth for the most part. Like, we used some imagery from private satellite imagery providers, but generally speaking, we did most of the research on Google Earth, which of course anyone can download and access. And as you said, Amnesty has done this for village burnings in Myanmar. There's like a million other examples of this. And I have to say, when I first started working on this, I didn't really think about the privacy implications probably enough. I think for a lot of journalists see reporting using satellite imagery as a way to cast light on places of the world where access for journalists is very difficult. So for instance, it's been used a lot in North Korea to identify prison camps, to identify nuclear sites. It's been used, of course, in Syria and Yemen to document aspects of those conflicts. So there is a clear kind of public good there. There's another aspect of this, which is that satellite imagery that is publicly available, at least to my knowledge, is not good enough that you can identify individuals. You could, with kind of other sources of information, probably identify people. But like, I think one of the problems is that in the journalism industry, like in the media industry, I should say, like there is a lot of interest in this type of reporting. I think, for good and bad reasons, like, it's obviously less expensive than trying to send a reporter to a place like, Iraq or Syria. It also has very legitimate uses, but there's no kind of consensus, I think, on what the ethics are. And I think even in our newsroom, we've handled that question in a pretty ad hoc way. In the Instagram story that I mentioned earlier, for instance, we obscured the faces of people. I think we had done the project by essentially sending my colleague and tracing his movements, and we left his face in and we blurred everybody else's faces so that they wouldn't be identified. But I think that as this type of reporting becomes more and more popular, we're seeing a lot of newsrooms building out teams specifically to use, stuff like images from social media and satellite images to model scenes and do other kinds of investigations. Like, as we're seeing this become more and more common, there needs to be a kind of ethical framework through which journalists can approach this and still handle these privacy issues responsibly, especially when it comes to people who are, not public figures and not necessarily, doing something that the public should know about.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to comment?
Well, I guess I can take on the one on what is a legitimate and what is not a legitimate use of data. It's not an easy question to answer, but I guess that the foundational element boils down to who is in control. Meaning that, for instance, in the framework that we have in the we have in the UK and we heredited from the European Union, the idea is that the individual must be in control of how their data must be used. This can take different forms. One is consent, another one is being enrolled in a contract, and therefore it's kind of the fact that you are in a contract that gives you the control about this. It could be a law, so we are talking about more a democratic process, or generally speaking, a rule of law, let's say, a statecraft kind of control. But generally speaking, this is it. The second aspect to be kept in mind is, of course, also that law in general is something that exists to regulate conflict, and because of technological developments and also because of this tendency basically to record and to increase the amount of information that we know about people exists. Of course, data protection is there basically also as a way to ensure that as this conflict emerges, the question is settled down in a certain way. Now, whether this question should be settled down in favor of the individual or in favor of those who are, let's say, thinking about using this data for less anodyne or less legitimate uses of data, this is exactly the kind of thing that we are seeing today, meaning that the conflict, for instance, in what the government here in the UK is proposing is exactly about tipping the balance more in favor of organizations and more in favor of government rather than in favor of the individual. or otherwise. And I mean, this is, but eventually, this is the question that we have to answer when it comes to deciding how we want our society to be. Do we want a society where you have an individual right that is protected, or do we want a society where we have a corporation right that is protected?
Thank you all. In the interest of time, I'm going to take one question there, and perhaps you pose the other questions, and then we will wrap up with all of you answering. So if you make it kind of concise and short.
Thank you for the lecture so far. I was just wondering, sorry, would you be able to expand at all on data surveillance linked with, for example, the Prevent strategy in the UK and all programs such as Schedule 7, which mainly targets Muslim minorities in the UK? So specifically, for example, regarding LATA, we've seen many examples of people being stopped at airports and demanded to hand over their phones, then basically to be checked. We've had, for example, lawyers who've been who faced prison sentences or fines for refusing to unlock their phones due to breach of confidentiality agreements with their clients. So it'll be interesting to hear something.
Thank you. And perhaps could you ask the two questions, and then maybe we can have general comments from each of you.
So Ali says, apps such as TikTok and some of the apps that have been developed during COVID capture a huge amount of information. For example, access photos on your phone in the case of Hong Kong. How can we protect ourselves against this? And Nicholas says, environmental activists are one of the most recurrent targets of surveillance. What mechanisms or initiatives based on data activism are currently in place to protect them?
Thank you. Anyone would like to answer? Maybe each one of you could talk about their area of expertise and how you are. Oh, sorry. And how you are. So maybe now that I have the microphone on, maybe each one of you could talk about your area of expertise in relation to these questions, particularly the question from the gentleman at the back, and then also in relation to TikTok, Hong Kong, and perhaps what in terms of environmental activists and what we could do to protect them. And I can start from on my left and moving forward, so each one can have a chance to say something.
Thank you. I think your question was about Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act and how that's been used, which, as you rightly said, from what I could hear, has been used in a relatively indiscriminate manner, mainly against Muslim travellers coming into the UK. In my view, it shouldn't exist. There shouldn't be a suspicionless surveillance power that means that someone coming into the country has their phone seized, no justification given, held and interrogated, and potentially all the data taken off of their phone. Or, as was the case in a case a few years ago, that you're then prosecuted for not cooperating with these people that are oppressing you by opening your phone and giving them all of your data when they've got no good reason to be asking for it in the first place. It's truly absurd. Also, bearing in mind the kind of capabilities that intelligence agencies have, there's little doubt that there's the potential to get that data through covert means. So I think there are some types of surveillance powers that are used for intimidation and other purposes too. And that's the case with protests. I mean, on environmental activists, I think that sometimes intrusive surveillance capabilities are used to make people feel watched. And also it can do all sorts of bad things in activist communities. It can break down trust. I mean, look at what happened after Spy Cops. People didn't know if their friends or even the fathers of their children were who they really said that they were because of this extraordinary intrusion. And it's really damaging then when you have that, because you don't know if your private conversations are being monitored electronically and all sorts of things. I've actually done some work with some activist groups over the years and including recently to work on digital privacy And it's kind of extraordinary the measures that people have to take. We've got a very short video, actually, Big Brother Watch. If you look on YouTube, I think it's called like Surveillance at Protests or Protecting Your Privacy at Protests. And if you really genuinely want to do that and you're worried that you might be targeted because you're an organiser or such like, and looking now at the police bill, how much easier it's becoming to be, it's already pretty easy to be criminalised if you're a protest organiser. It's going to be much easier soon. Then doing things like taking a second phone that you don't ordinarily use, or a burner phone, or this kind of thing to a protest might not be a bad idea. You can have all kinds of things. Whether it's that you're worried about being arrested and your device is being seized, or whether IMSI catchers, for example, are being used, which is basically a mobile interception device. That police can take to large events and watch and listen in on what people are saying to each other. So it's a real, even in the UK, but I mean, it's a genuine real threat that affects all kinds of very legitimate and lawful campaigning activities.
Thank you. Peter?
Yeah, I echo a lot of that. And you've also got the policing and crime bill, which is going through Parliament at the moment, which could end up with 51-week sentences for protesters as well. And there's, I think for environmental activists in particular, we know they're going to be targeted more by the government. They've already signalled this. The Home Secretary, Bridget Patel, has signalled that environmental activists, people like Insulate Britain and Extinction Rebellion, are going to be targeted more. So I think it is going to be an increasing battleground as well. We're going to see, between the kind of things that we revealed at openDemocracy around, like private spies and BP hiring surveillance, between that and the use of the law to try and curtail environmental protesters, we're going to see this as more and more of an issue probably in the coming years.
Thank you, Peter. Mario?
Well, I guess, yes, from a data protection point of view, the framework gives you a lot of tools that you can use either as an individual or collectively in order to challenge the status quo. One of those has already been mentioned this evening, was the subject access request, so the ability to ask questions about what data they have, why they are using this. And I mentioned the collective aspect in particular because this can be, for instance, this has been used by us, Open Rights Group, for, let's say, increasing transparency over profiling after Cambridge Analytica, so generally speaking, to investigate how these practices were working, and this is why today I'm able to tell you that their profiles are not as accurate as they would like them to be. But also, there are other, let's say, players in this field, like I can think of a Workers Info Exchange, who are trying to file subject access requests to Uber, to gig economy employers, and basically create data banks where they use the data that they have about drivers to basically reverse engineer the logic behind the automated systems that Uber is using in order to prioritize certain people compared to others, and basically to manage the employment relationship that they have with them. Apart from that, I think that something very important is here the role that data protection has in empowering journalists when it comes to these things, and there are at least two things. One, apart from data protection, let's say. One is the fact that the GDPR provides basically a lot of obligations for the organization who have data to record the activities, to explain what you're doing, and to draft documents that are, for instance, analyzing the impact of certain activities could have on individual rights. This is particularly important because, yes, on the one hand, it kind of imposes organization to see whether what they're doing will harm you or not, but most importantly, it creates data trails. It creates documents that can later be accessed via freedom of information requests, for instance, and therefore challenge what the government has done. This was something that, for instance, as Open Rights Group, we did during the coronavirus pandemic with the test and trace, with the digital contact tracing applications and so forth. But generally speaking, these documents are useful because they basically take a picture of what's the reasoning and what's the balance of interest that the government or even the private corporation have made about a certain issue, and this is fundamentally very, very relevant for the democratic debate when it comes to, basically scrutinizing these kind of things. Well, the second part is that comes to my mind is exactly about the fact that, let's say, data protection is enforced by a regulator. In the UK, it's called the Information Commissioner Office. And this regulator is supposed to be independent. What we are seeing today, and let's say, I mean, this goes a bit in line to a lot of other things that we have seen in the crime and sentencing bill or in other, let's say, initiatives of this government, is exactly that they want to put the ICO under government control. So fundamentally want to undermine the independence of this authority. This is a problem for journalists as well, because of course, let's say the law, the GDPR per se, is not applies without prejudice for journalistic activities. So, for instance, you're not, as a journalist, required to disclose information to a person you are investigating because this would prejudice, you know, like the journalistic activity that you're doing. This is called journalistic exemptions. There are, let's say, rules basically. But the point is, if the arbiter of these rules starts to be pressured and starts basically to have his or her salary that depends on whether the government is pleased by what they're doing or not, this of course means that the ICO will become a stick in the hands of the government to go after you. So this is also something to be kept in mind.
Thank you. And Megha, final word.
I'll just speak briefly to the question about protests and TikTok and saving photos. Yeah, I think I'm not an expert on digital security, and I wouldn't want to pretend to be, but just as a person that has thought about these issues when covering protests myself, I would say that the most important thing is to, like, wherever you're thinking about doing this, wherever you're going out to protest or whatever the high risk, the activity that you're doing that you don't want others to know about is, I think it's really important to think about it in the most specific way possible. So if I were going to a protest in Hong Kong, I maybe would not bring a phone that has TikTok on it because TikTok keeps, TikTok's parent company keeps most of its servers in mainland China. And even TikTok keeps its data in Singapore. So in that case, you would be thinking about, you know, who is going to subpoena this data or go through a legal process to try to obtain you know, any data that the app might be preserving about me. So if I was going to a protest, you know, here in London or, you know, in a different city, the calculus might be completely different. So I think it matters a lot what the app is, where the data is stored, who has access to the data, and what methods government officials or law enforcement or what have you can go through to try to obtain that data. So I think that kind of risk analysis is really important, and it's something that demonstrators are doing increasingly, I think, in different parts of the world. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And of course, you know, what is important here is to educate the public. And I think this has been a fantastic panel in terms of educating us and helping us think about what we're doing and how we're doing things, and perhaps how we can challenge authority by understanding the consequences of, you know, data and privacy and so on. And I think there are some people who are actually using technology and digital technologies in very positive ways to try and counter these movements. And it might be another session talking about, you know, the possibilities of reversing all these, you know, effects, or what we can see as being negative effects on civic rights and privacy and so on, by, you know, channeling digital technologies in positive ways. That's all I can say, because, you know, I come from media studies, and it's really important to kind of always think about not only the problems, but also the possibilities and the human agency in that. But thank you so much to all of you. It's been a fantastic panel, and thank you for the organizers.
Yeah, just finally, just say thank you, Dina, for hosting us today, and thank you, Silkie, Peter, Mariano, and Megha. We hope that you'll join us again at some point later on. And we'll be holding more events like this. Please do follow us on Twitter at SOAS ICOP, so we can just keep you posted about any more events that we do. And thanks again for coming out this evening, and to our online audience. I'll just leave you with Alison, who's going to end with a few words.
Thank you. Thank you for being such a lovely audience. Thank you for being here this evening. And Professor Dina Matar, brilliant chairing, fabulous panel. I've learned so much this evening. It's been absolutely incredible. Obviously, there are great potentials for us, but we are also having great violence done to us, to our integrity and to our independence and our individuality through the mechanisms that we've learnt about this evening. So we do need this expert advice to help us to evade these tentacles, which none of us can see because we're addicted. We're addicted to the consumer appetites that have been developed in us. So it's been an amazing evening. I've learned so much, and thank you very, very much to Nina and Sanjana, who's here, and to the whole ICOP team. Fantastic, fantastic evening. Thank you very much.